Thanks for joining me. This lab session is entitled JMeter Performance Report Analysis Lab. JMeter supplies sufficient report output to support useful data analysis. It is good practice for a performance test analyst to have an analysis approach that helps with perusing data and performance reports. The stakeholders need to understand the condition of the application. Will it serve the customer's functional needs, or does it need improvements? A performance test analyst needs to approach reporting analysis with certainty, such as interpret the information. Don't leave it a mystery. Identify and document the trends you found. Draw out the findings that are most important and directly align the story told with your desired goals. Summarize your findings and then deliver a report that contains observations, recommendations, and possible conclusions, which include an appropriate action plan. Though it is tempting to include a sample report, I will refrain. I have learned over time that reporting can be an artistic endeavor. Therefore, it is better to inspire you and promote your thinking than to give you a confined approach, such as, here is how to write the report. No, just keep the thoughts in mind that I conveyed in this lesson. Before we get into the lab, here is a rough plan. I will do my best to keep the overall time focused on doing results analysis, but I need to also communicate some setup thoughts. So here's the plan. The lab plan will take 2 sessions. First, I want to review the baseline report again with you. Then we want to talk some on test scripts, demonstrate those, look at those a little bit closer, and then review the workload workbook. There's several sheets I have in there that might be useful to you going forward. And we want to run the performance test. We've already run the performance test, so we're going to look at the reports from them using the JMeter dashboard reporting, and we want to look at the findings. So here we go. As a prelude to the baseline discussion, you probably want to know, how did we get to this point? Remind me. Let's start with the requirements. In the requirements, we had the last 4 requirements that nailed what we're looking to do as far as performance testing is concerned. So we discovered through it that we will probably want to do an endurance test, at least one, with spikes. We'd probably want to do, for sure, a load test with some level of concurrency. And we'd want to do a stress test with maybe some endurance sprinkled in it. In other words, for some particular length of time. And for sure, also we need baseline test information that would provide us with an idea of how good performance could be as far as response time and data being passed over a period of time. Not only that, this is an idea of what a work model might look like. It's not perfect, but it gives us an idea that could have come about with several work sessions, collaborating with the stakeholders for this test project. We had already identified what functions would be involved, and we had already identified the user rate at a peak time. So these numbers came from that. They were looking at possibly 100 concurrent users running these particular tasks at a peak time of the day. And so from that, we started coming up with what would be the daily activity, what would be the peak activity. And these would be in the real world based on what's in the log, the access log. What does it tell us? What kind of activity have the application experienced over some period of time? Could be for the previous year or previous quarter or even just the last month. And so that would give us some information to then determine on a smaller scale, what do we need to do with these functions in terms of how many users and how fast the pace should be so that we can run tests that make sense. Hopefully that was okay with you. So the breakdown here is the average think time. You always want to put some level of think time. Normally on average it's somewhere between 7 and 10. But with these, I saw where we needed to make them a little bit more think time involved, like 60 minutes for the log in, log out. Because really what we are trying to emulate is logging in and logging out is something that many people will do in the course of a day in most applications, and sometimes just log in, sit there, let it sit for some period of time. Maybe they think they might do something in the application, they might not, and then they may log off at some point in time. So it gives you a feel, it gives the testing some activity that's external to the real most important functions like inquiry and flight to pay and flight itinerary, where the others are fillers. And so anyway, there was a breakdown that I came up with here on what amount of time should be devoted to think time. Then there's the function times. After we ran tests, I was able to come up with rough amount of time that each of the functions would take, and that's basically baseline information. And then we chose something that normally on a server there would be something in the neighborhood of 200 to 300 on average connections or transactions per second or requests per second. And so by taking that number, dividing it by 10, I said that's roughly about what we should work with or work toward in order for the traffic to be decent. And then from there, to get into a stress level, you might go up to 40 transactions per second and so on. Then finally that came up with, we've got a calculation that was used to identify, well, how many users should that translate into? And so we could have a maximum of 600-700 users in some of the full tests. And we'll see what we came up with so far on that. Now, that gives you a breakdown of what we were looking at it from I labeled it a load standpoint, some kind of workload model. And also with the workload, we want to make sure that we're sort of sticking with these percentages as much as possible. So we're saying that the majority of the functions would be the use of the inquiry function and log in, log off. The second level of activity would be the flight to pay and flight itinerary. And then the ancillary or filler functions would be the flight change, cancellation, and registry, where those are not as many on a given day. So this hopefully reflects the amount of traffic that might come through either on a per hour basis, peak time basis, or daily basis. So let's go back to, let's go to the test schedule here and talk just a little bit about the baseline test. So baseline testing is based on, if you pardon my pun, the release, how the releases were going to take place. We were describing that the project from a development standpoint would be in terms of releases, and we see roughly 7 releases, and in each release would be a major function added to the application. Well, in the baseline test, that means we'd have to break it down the same way. As the release, as a particular function is developed and going to be in a new release that might be out on a monthly basis, we need to, during the sprint, be able to test, and all we'd have would be 1 or 2 or so, depending on what release we're in, we'd have so many functions to work with. Well, I decided since we're not in the real world on this, we already have the application at its completed state, I can then run a baseline test with all of the functions together, just making sure that there's not too much traffic, just enough to give us somewhat of what we might think of as a realistic test. So, with that in mind, I'm going to come back to this, so I'm not going to talk in more detail about this at the moment. What's highlighted and why and so on, we'll talk about that. What we want to do now is look at the script itself. And I will bring you there. And you'll see what's highlighted are the functions that we had in the script. But this one is specifically for baseline, so we made some changes. Let's go and take a look at that. We're cut down the amount of traffic. We only have one user that's going to process, and we're only delaying 1 second, and the time to ramp up is 5 seconds, while the hold time, where we're going to try to keep that process running for no more than 3 seconds, and then within 10 seconds, we want that to shut down. So we use that similar approach on each one. So if I take you to the registry, you see something similar to that. The flight pay, one loop. So we're going to process 1 user. Flight change, 1 user. Flight inquiry, 1 user. Itinerary, 1. Itinerary C, cancellation, 1. And if we go up to the test plan itself, we've got this box checked to say run thread groups consecutively. So the thread groups will not run in a parallel mode, they will run consecutively. So when one is done, the next one will start. That will also keep the amount of traffic to a minimum. And so we ran that test and we produced results. The results, we'll go back to the spreadsheet. and look at response times. On the response time sheet, we're at the top, we're looking at the first set of data actually has to do with the baseline. I also take that average list here and moved it over to this little chart, which will show response times based on a particular test type. So we have the baseline, load, stress, and so on. Well, the baseline tests produce this result. We're saying that the average time for these functions was under a minute, which was good, and the one with the most time was register, took 669 milliseconds. So it's still less than a minute, but close to these are less than a second, not minute, second. And so the milliseconds was 669 for this one, just under a second. Excuse me. So that's the information for the baseline. Okay, let's get into a further discussion on the test scripts and the results. How did we get results from running these tests? The first test, again, is the baseline. And so in the Tools section, after the test is completed, we can do what's called Generate HTML Report. Now, keep in mind that the older way with JMeter was to utilize the internal reports, such as summary report, the view results tree, aggregate report, and so on. And there's several others that are useful. They still are useful. They can be utilized, especially if you just want GUI reports to look at. What I did in this case was instead use the HTML reporting. It's also known as the dashboard reporting. And so, in order to do that, once the test is complete, hold on, let me back up one more. On the view results tree, what I do is I put in a file. It's a JTL file. That's a Java test log. And I give it a name. When I don't give it any path, it's going to go into the bin directory, the JMeter's bin directory. And so if I clicked on Browse here, you would see over in JMeter here, bin, there it is, webtours.jtl. There's other ones like the perf test, if you remember way back in earlier portion of the course, we were utilizing these files. Well, in this case, I just called it web tours, and I'm just going to use this over and over again to put out report data using the vUser tree report. That is sufficient to create the HTML reports. All right, so cancel out of here. And when you start a test, what actually happens is, if I'll just do that right now, because that file name is specified there, it's going to want to know, what are you going to do? Do you want to append the new report data to the existing file? Or you don't want to start, you changed your mind, or you want to overwrite the existing file. This is what I normally do. With the new data, I want a brand new file and the data for the appropriate test. In this case, I'm not going to start. So, just remember that when you use the file name, wanting to output the view results into that file, then what you need to do is to overwrite it each time. Otherwise, if you append it, you might not get the kind of results you want. All right, now let's move on. So what do we do with that? Well, by using the tool for the HTML, generate HTML report, we're going to point to that file. So we click the browse, we go over to that the bin directory, and it just so happens to be pointing there now. And so I see the file, clicked on it, and then click open. Then we want the user.properties file. That's also in the bin directory, and there it is right here. We click on it, click open. Unfortunately, we have to do this each time, but it's not that much information. And then finally, what we want is an output area. We need to have a location already created. Otherwise, we can use this button up here to create a new folder. So what we're doing is pointing to some folder. And in my case, I set up under JMeter a folder called Outputs. So point there, and here's where I was building HTML report data. So for the baseline, this was the name of the report. As I said, of the folder. And as I said, you can create a new folder right from here. But you point to it so that you tell JMeter where you want that HTML to be formatted. Now, that folder needs to be empty. If it's not empty, it's not going to work. It won't allow you to overwrite. It's just going to give you a message that it needs to be empty. That's how you do that. All right, so I'm going to click open. And so once you have that information, then you just click on the generate report. You'll see a message appear in this black area here telling you that it's generating, and then it will tell you that it's completed. And once it's completed, you can then close this box. Now, so that's how the output HTML reports are generated after each test run. So then, if we go to that particular location in JMeter, Outputs, we'll again see these output folders, and the baseline is here. So I double click on that, and it basically is going to create this structure each time. And what we're looking for in each of those files, like I'll go to the load. It looks the same, but this is the common file that we're interested in, an HTML file to look at the reports. Let me go back to baseline and double click on index.html, and then we get the dashboard reports from JMeter. We didn't have to do any configuration. It's generated for you. Once you provide the pointers to where it should look, then it can generate the reports for you. So then, not only do I have dashboard, I have charts and custom graphs. I have not used the custom graphs. I'm not going to talk about that at this point. Now, the first thing you see for the dashboard is this AppDex. We talked about this previously, and I just want to mention once again, it can be convoluted because of all of the internal data that it's collecting for these reports. But basically, you could utilize this if you have an SLA that you're trying to determine, is are these transactions or processes or functions running within a certain parameter, certain toleration and frustration. I tend not to use this as much, but that depends on how you utilize or do reporting to your stakeholders and what information they're looking for. So if they are looking for this type of information, you can make use of it, and you can actually copy and paste this data into an Excel spreadsheet and go from there. I'm going to scroll further down, and then we have a statistics report. I like this one. Typically, what I do is just click here one time, excuse me, and now I have the information that I really want right at the top here. That may not always happen the way you'd like, but you can still get to that data and then copy paste what you want into an Excel spreadsheet. This is what you saw a little earlier, where I pulled that information for that particular report. So that one's a useful one. That one you normally see. It's similar to what you see in the aggregate report and the summary report inside the GUI desktop for JMeter. Okay, now, so that's how you get this report. I'm going to just mention a little bit more. I think, again, I did mention this before with the charts section. You have overtime reports, throughput reports, response time reports. So there's almost a plethora, if you don't mind me saying that, of reports that you can get for these runs, and providing you with some detailed information, especially when the tests or load test and stress test and endurance test and so on. It really provides you with some very useful information. For baseline, I would say not much. That's not, you're doing one user type stuff. And so that first report, going back to the dashboard report, that information is good and good enough for baseline test results. My time has ended for this session. I thank you for yours. Join me in the next video.